Ladies and gentlemen, if you are seeing my face and hearing my voice and seeing a slide called Getting Started, AppleScript for Capture One, you are in the right place at the right time. In order to accommodate anyone having difficulties with the technicals of getting the webinar started and logged in, we will begin the webinar in 2 minutes. In the meanwhile, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, or I guess introduce yourself in the chat, and we will begin here in about 1.5 minutes. Popping up in your window is the DT Coding Series Part 3 download. If you are intending to follow along the scripts at home on your own computer, you are welcome to download that. The 2 separate documents include both the slide deck and the zips of the scripts. Those are both optional. You may find following along visually in the webinar is easier, or you may find following the scripts on your own computer is easier. We will also cover at the beginning of the webinar how to install the appropriate software to view those scripts. And we will begin the presentation in about 40 seconds. Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin the presentation in 15 seconds. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin the presentation momentarily. James, all set on your side? Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to part 3 of the DT Coding series. This is Getting Started, AppleScript for Capture One. In parts 1 and 2 of the series, we discussed what coding is, what problems it does and does not solve. And then in part 2, we discussed how Pixel DT's service bureau, is using coding to streamline and automate their post-processing, including barcode recognition, file naming, derivative generation, OCR, QC, and all that jazz. You can watch those 2 webinars for free on our website. Today, in part 3, we'll be walking you through step-by-step how to get started with AppleScripting, specifically AppleScripting in a Capture One workflow. We will begin that class, this agenda, at the very beginning. We don't expect previous coding experience, so we'll start with what applications are required, and we will today build in real time 3 separate tools that solve real-world problems. We'll do that from start to finish. In parts 4 and 5, we'll be doing the same sort of thing, starting from the beginning, doing examples, and we'll be doing those for Python and the Capture One SDK, 2 other methodologies of coding and imaging workflows. If you are unclear on the differences between AppleScript, Python, and the Capture One SDK, I would refer you back to Coding Part 1. Finally, later this year, we will be doing a capstone class. It will be a 2-day class, all day, both days. And that is going to dive much deeper than any of these Getting Started webinars will. We'll be getting quite into the weeds, doing some fairly advanced examples, and we'll be working into fairly advanced workflows. That capstone class will culminate with a fairly challenging certification test. So that is sort of the culmination of this series. And I just want to say that if you have, coming into today, a lot of programming experience, that you may find today to be slightly on the slower side. That will not be the case in the capstone class. Conversely, if you have no programming experience, you should not be intimidated. Feel free to stick around all day today, or all webinar today, because we are not assuming that you have any previous coding background, and we will still be able to do some realistic real-world coding today. Lastly, I do want to point out that capstone class will be a paid class. We do have an early bird registration discount, as well as a special offer that will be emailed to you following this class, so do take a look carefully at that follow-up email. All right, so onward to today's presentation. To introduce ourselves, I'm Doug Peterson. I'm the head of R&D and product management at DT. As of 2020, I am also one of the co-owners. I've been coding since I was 10 years old, and I like to say that I narrowly escaped becoming a professional programmer when I instead attended Ohio University for commercial photography and visual communications. Go Bobcats. Jim.
Hi, Doug. Thanks for having us today. I'm Jim. I'm almost the opposite of Doug. Started out doing VisCom photography. Feel most at home in a studio, actually. But however, I've sidestepped into programming. So I guess we're meeting this from two ends. I'm the ex-product one and now enterprise engagement manager for Capture One. And I work mostly with large commercial software clients where automation is critical to remain profitable. I work mostly with the newer Capture One Enterprise platform, which is still fairly new comparatively to Pro. It does offer a degree of extra functions when it comes to automation and workflow. We'll take a quick look at that later for those who are interested. But until then, back to Doug.
Very good. So today's agenda will be pretty straightforward. We'll briefly talk about software you might want to own in order to do Apple scripting for Capture One. We'll then take a look at three real world examples of coding that we can accomplish with AppleScript. And then we'll take a look at next steps between here and the capstone class if you want to dive deeper into AppleScript. So first, what software should we have for Apple scripting? Well, there are two main options. Script Editor, which you can bring up in Spotlight right now, is free and it is already installed on every single Mac. So every person who is viewing this on a Mac could just open up applications. I think it's under Utilities, or maybe it's just under Applications. I always Spotlight search it, and you can bring up Apple Script Editor. That said, that's not what we'd suggest. What we'd suggest is actually an application called Script Debugger. It is substantially better at troubleshooting and substantially better at the kinds of markup, dictionary access, and more advanced features. You can kind of think about Script Editor as being like Microsoft Notepad. It's free, it's already installed, but it's pretty darn basic. And Script Editor is being more like Microsoft Word. It costs money, you have to install it, but if you're gonna be spending any meaningful amount of time doing Apple scripting, we'd really suggest Script Debugger. Neither Phase One nor DT sells Script Debugger as a software. It's a separate company, an unrelated product, and we're not getting anything from promoting them. But we did contact them, and we did receive from them an offer for our clients to get 20% off. That code will be emailed to you immediately after this webinar. In the meanwhile, you can, in fact, download the free trial. So feel free, if you are at home, to just grab Script Debugger from latenightsw.com. And that's it. That's all you need to start writing AppleScript. You can use the free Script Debugger, free Script Editor, or you can buy Script Debugger, and you're ready to start typing in some AppleScript. So let's start doing that, and we'll do that starting with example one, flagging if uncaptioned. And today's methodology, we're going to sort of introduce a boss's request, and then we're going to translate that into something that is more coding oriented, and then we're actually going to do the programming behind it. So let's say our boss comes to us and asks us to write some code that, quote, flags any images that lack a caption. Well, before we write that code, we should try to find out as much about the use case as possible. My first question, usually when somebody at the company comes to me asking for some code, is why? Not confrontationally, just to ask, what is the surrounding situation that makes coding a useful and worthwhile thing for us to do? And what do I need to know about the situation to make sure I'm not answering the wrong problem? So here's your hypothetical scenario here. We're working at a studio with multiple shooting bays, a high volume of models shot every single day. And as a workflow, our intention is that every single object we shoot, every model that we shoot, should be captioned. And our boss wants to find a quick way to flag any images that missed a caption. So we're just looking to flag any images that didn't have a caption because they should have a caption. We want to flag quickly if we missed them. So it's a QC step. It's a simple enough task, and it's exactly the kind of task that coding is good for. So let's break down that request and recognize that the way that the boss did it, the way that the boss's request is phrased, is using the sort of nouns, verbs, and sentence structures derived from a user's perspective. And what we really need is to change that into the nouns and verbs and syntax of computer language. So first, the word flag. What does flag mean here? Flag needs to be more specific. So as a few options we might use, we might add it to an album, we might rename it, we might do a star rating, but we're going to choose here to use the color tag red as a flag. So if we want to flag a file, we're going to set the color tag to red. And then what do we mean by images? An image is something that the user might call the thing they see inside of Capture One, but it's not technically accurate. In Capture One, what we're actually doing is using, selecting, and adjusting variants. What do I mean by that? Well, it's pretty obvious that when you have an image raw file that we have two variants of in Capture One, that each of the things that we're looking at is a variant. In this case, look at the left variant off to the side. It is marked with a number 1 in the top right corner. It's black and white. And so obviously it's the first variant of that raw file. And likewise, the second variant there is marked with the number 2 and it's color. What's less obvious is that even when a raw file only has one variant, it is still a variant. So while the number 1 does not explicitly appear in the top right corner, it is still properly referred to as the first, in this case only, but first variant of this image file. So in Capture One, you're always dealing with variants. So if we go back to the verbiage from our boss, we need to actually change image to variant because that's the noun that Capture One would consider. This may strike you as a little bit pedantic, and if so, you're correct. Programming is very pedantic. We need to know the exact correct and precise nouns and verbs to use to accomplish a specific task. We also need to be specifically identifying a given instance of that noun. We can't just say variant. We need to identify which variant. So, for example, look at this screen grab. In this screen grab, we have two separate Capture One sessions. You may or may not be aware you can open more than one session simultaneously in Capture One. And here we have two sessions open. And each of those sessions has multiple images, some of which have multiple variants, and some of which, more than one of which, have a red color tag. So if I showed you this screen grab and I said, Bob or Jill or Frank, could you please set the color tag of the variant to red? You'd immediately reply by going, which variant? You have to be more specific. And to understand how we specify a variant in AppleScript, we need to understand how those nouns inside of Capture One relate to each other as regards AppleScript. So here is a very partial, what they call an object model. An object model diagrams out the relationship between nouns inside of AppleScript for a given program. So inside of application Capture 120, we can then look for the relationship down this line and trace this color tag from the color tag in the bottom upward through. So a color tag as a noun belongs to a variant, which belongs to a document, which belongs to Capture One. Let's take a look at that in a little bit more specificity inside of Capture One. So we're just going to bring these off to the side here, and we'll look at Capture One and a color tag. In this case, it's a blue color tag that I'm pointing to. That blue color tag belongs to this variant, which belongs in turn to the overall document, in this case, the session on the left, which in turn belongs to Capture One. So we're referring to the color tag of the variant of the document of the application. So if we combine now our goal, so we've covered the object model. We understand these nouns relate to each other. Our next step is to start to break up this request into individual actionable things we can then learn the code for. And this is very common whether you're talking about somebody who's had 0 programming experience or 20 years and 2 PhDs. They'll still break an overall problem into smaller problems, do each of the smaller problems first before they start to combine that into a full program or full script. So let's combine our goal of set the color tag to red with our knowledge of the object model for what a color tag belongs to in Capture One. Just a quick note, if you are following at home, the downloadable zip files do have step-by-step for this, but we're not quite yet to those zip files. So far, we're just diagramming out how this object model looks in terms of structure. This is not yet valid code. So bear with us for a little bit longer before you start typing anything in or start to open up any of those scripts. So off to the one side here, we see application document variant color tag. And off to the right, we see the same syntactical breakup of hierarchy: an application, a document, a variant, and a color tag. Now, we said we had to be specific, and so for document, we're going to say current document. We'll look at that more later, and likewise, variant, we're going to say variant 1. That just means the first variant of the current document of Capture 1. That handles our nouns. Let's take a look at some of the verbs we have to add. So what do we want to do with the application Capture 120? What do we want to do with the current document? What do we want to do with the variant? In this case, what we're going to use is the verb tell, which then forms a block that we have to terminate or end with end tell. Everything in between the beginning tell and the end tell forms what we call a tell block. Everything in between is told to that specific object. So let's take a look at what that means. Here, every line of code is directed toward Capture 1. They take place between the tell application Capture 120 and the corresponding matched end tell at the end of that block. They are said to be inside the Capture 1 tell block. Likewise, these 3 inner lines of code will be applied to the current document. And then finally, this one line of code, which is not yet technically a line of code, but this section of code will apply to the first variant, or variant 1, again, of the current document of the application. So it's all hierarchical, and we are specifying what color tag we are talking about. So now, importantly, you'll notice that this has indentation. It has color themes or color markup. Those colors and that indentation is actually done automatically in both Script Debugger or Script Editor. If you're typing in your code and you save it, it will automatically compile and format it to have this indentation and coding color theme. All right, so for that line of code, that essential line of code that we're actually doing something, we're going to use the verb set. So we've told application Capture 120 to tell the current document, to tell variant 1 to do something to its color tag. What do we want to do? What is that verb? It is set. Set the color tag to red. So we have some valid looking code. We have successfully parsed the object model. We're ready to roll. Let's push play, and oh, we immediately get an error message. And this is basically the fundamental nature of computer programming, is that it is 20% writing code and 80% debugging or fixing that code. And that is a very realistic experience for us to have. So let's take a look at what this error message is and see if we can figure out what's going on. So the error message reads, Capture 120 got an error, can't make red into type integer. Okay, so one of the first things we're going to do is we're going to go to Script Debugger, and we're going to go inside of Script Debugger to File, Open Dictionary, Capture 120. The dictionary in Script Debugger is more robust and more useful than the dictionary that you'll find in Script Editor. And in the Script Debugger version, you'll see that it has 3 different views: Dictionary, Object Model, and Explorer. That's in the top left corner there, Dictionary, Object Model, Explorer. We're going to go to the Explorer, and we're going to go search out that specific color tag. What we're doing now is basically finding in Script Debugger the same object model hierarchy that we described earlier in a diagram here in the slides. So let's navigate through our object model. We find application Capture 120, we click on that. We find the list of documents, and we click on that, and then we click the first of those documents, the current document. And then we find the list of variants, and of that list of variants, we're going to click on the first variant, literally just the variant listed first. And then we're going to look down at color tag. And now take this all in, because I'm going to zoom in just a second. Okay, so let's zoom in to that color tag, and we'll see that it's described as having a value of 4. Now, I may have missed that day in kindergarten, but I don't remember 4 being a color. So why is color tag set to 4? Well, this is kind of common in computer programming. If there is a fixed list of options, then you can't, for example, in Capture 1, color tag with fuchsia or mayonnaise. You have to pick from a set specific list of colors. And when that's the case, it's often in computer programming represented by an integer or a whole number, rather than the English word for that value. And that's for a variety of different reasons. One obvious one is that not all computer programmers speak English as their first language. And if you use something like purple, it may be misspelled, and a single letter misspelling could cause it not to work. So how do we know what for means? What color is for? Well, here we have in Capture One the session that is open, and we go literally to the first variant in the current document, and we see that the color tag is green. So we know that if the color tag is green and it's set to 4, that 4 is green. Likewise, we can go backwards. We can manually change this to a color tag of red. We then return to Script Debugger, and very importantly, after we return to Script Debugger, we need to push refresh. Otherwise, it will not load the new value. It doesn't do it in real time. It does it when you push refresh. So we push refresh and look again closely, and the value is now 1. If we go through and do this for a few more colors, what we'll realize, hopefully at some point, is that the integer value is not completely arbitrary or random or capricious. It is, in fact, the position in the menu when you go to click on a color tag. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, pink, purple are 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there is a rhyme and reason to it, but we have to find that rhyme and reason, and we've used Script Debugger to find that reason. So let's return to our error message. We should understand now why we got an error message trying to run this script. Capture 120 got an error, can't make red into type integer. And that's because Capture One can't use red as an integer, as a whole number, which is what color tag expects. If instead we change this to the number 1, which we've learned is the corresponding integer to red, and we run the script, all is well, the value or the color tag will be set to red. We could also have looked this up in the object model. So there's the Explorer, there's the dictionary, there's the object model. All of them are different ways of representing the same object model relationship and noun verb syntax of AppleScript for Capture One. Here we see that under the object model documents, variants, that color tag has get set access and is of type integer. Integer, again, whole number. And access get set just means we can both read that value or set that value, right? So we have read-write access. Just a different way of learning the same thing that color tag expects a number. So we've got the color tag part of this worked out. We're actually making pretty good headway. What about the caption part? When we say lacks a caption, what is the caption? Well, again, if we return to the AppleScript dictionary inside of Script Debugger, we will see that if we search for if we search for caption in the dictionary, we'll get no items found. So if instead we manually go through the object model, we'll find that, again, there's no caption, but there is a content description. And this would correspond, if we look in Capture One, it would correspond to the same set of cells wherein we see in Capture One. In Capture One, we see description. So again, there's no field called caption. There's a field called description. But I want to point something out, and this is very, very important for you getting started in AppleScript for Capture One. It is not necessarily the case that the field name in Capture One corresponds exactly to the field name in AppleScript for Capture One. In this case, it says, quote, description over here in the Capture One application user interface. Whereas in the dictionary, we see that it is properly and correctly referred to as content description. And again, programming is very, very pedantic. If we try to set description, it will just come back and say, I have no idea what the heck you're talking about, never heard of it, don't know what it is. You have to tell it to work on the content description as listed in the dictionary. So let's update caption to content description. And let's go write some code that can check the value of a content description of a variant, or the content description of a variant. This is very similar to when we set the color tag, but in the case of the color tag, we wanted to write a value to the color tag. We wanted to set the color tag. In this case, we actually want to go the opposite direction. We want to pull the data up from content description and put it somewhere. And where we put it is going to be a variable. So this line of code, set the current description to content description, is creating a variable called the current description and putting content description inside of it. Now, to get into AppleScripting in an advanced sense, you'll have to learn a lot about variables. There are different kinds of variables that can store different kinds of data, and have to be addressed with specific syntax. But for right now, to store the value of content description somewhere, just think about a variable as a bucket. We have a bucket. The name of the bucket is the current description, and we're going to take and put into that bucket the content description of variant 1 of the current document of capture 1. So let's go to capture 1. Let's type in manually a content description, in this case, smashed glass bottle. This is a scan of a 4x5 transparency using a DT system. And we'll go back to Script Debugger, turn on the Result and Variables tab in the top right corner. So that's the gear icon here in the top right corner. And in the top right corner with the gear icon on, we'll just push play. And what we'll see is there in the results, and we'll highlight it for you here, the current description, the bucket named the current description, is now called, now has a value of smashed glass bottle. Now keep in mind, our boss wants us to do things with variants that lack a content description, not to variants that contain a specific kind of content description. So we don't want to know what this looks like when it's filled with something. We actually want to know what it's filled with, what it looks like when it's not filled with anything. So we go back to capture 1, and this time we're going to clear that field. Literally, we're going to double click on it, use delete or backspace, push enter. And with an empty content description, we're going to run this script again. And this time, the result of that script is 2 quote marks. This sounds, again, a little bit pedantic, but what we have to remember is that in capture 1, as with most programming, a field must exist. It just might be that it exists with an empty value. That's different than saying it doesn't exist. It's not that it lacks a caption. It is instead that it has a content description of quote, quote. That is an empty string or nothing, right? So we want to look for variables whose content description is blank or quote, quote. So we change that to an if statement, what we'd call a conditional statement. A conditional if statement, if a variant's content description is quote, quote, set its color tag to red, translates into code exactly like that. And we put it inside of the tell block to the variant such that we first take the content description of the variant and put it in a bucket. And we look at the bucket and say, if the current description is empty, then set the color tag to 1. The if must be terminated with an end if, and it forms, again, an if block. So just like we had tell and end tell, and that forms a tell block in between, we have an if statement and an end if statement, and in between is the if block. That if block only runs, that code is only used if, in fact, the the current description is quote, quote. So we're getting close. For those of you following along, we are almost there. We have to repeat this now for each of the variants because so far we've only been doing variant 1. So repeating for every variant, if the current description is empty, we're going to set the color tag to red. Let's take a look at that in code. And again, we have a different kind of block. The block here is a repeat block. It forms a loop. So this is going to go from the repeat to the end repeat and back, and down and back, and down and back, and loop over and over and over again. The first time it loops, it's going to take the first variant and put it into the block, into the variable, the variant. And that means it's going to look a lot like the last version. In the first run through, variant 1 is being talked to, but then each subsequent time a new variant is put into that variable, and we're talking to variant 1, and then variant 2, and then variant 3, and so on for all variants. So if you look at the code on the screen, this is now valid and complete code. If you look in the downloadable zip, it is called final for example 1, and it is going to talk to application capture 1. It's going to talk to the current document, and for each of the variants, it will repeat that if that variant has a empty content description, it will set the color tag of that variant to 1. In other words, it will accomplish flagging any images that lack a caption, but again, parlanced into programming speak. So let's review. Example 1, we learned about object model, the relationship between nouns for AppleScripting in capture 1. We learned about tell blocks that must be terminated with an end tell. We learned about variables, simply put, in this case, a bucket into which we can put a value and later look at that value. We looked at if blocks, which must be terminated with an end if and only happen if the if statement is true. And we looked at repeat blocks, where a thing gets put into a variable bucket and loops back around to the next thing that's put into that variable bucket, and then again and again until all of the things have been put into that bucket one at a time. Now is an appropriate time for questions regarding this first example. If you have more generalized questions or questions like how would I AppleScript XYZ scenario, we will have time for some of those questions at the end of the presentation, but for right now, we want to do questions related to example 1. Arnab has been monitoring the chat. If you've been doing questions, Arnab will have flagged them, and so now we're going to ask Arnab to please, for us, flag up the first question. What does the gears icon represent? That's a great question. If we go back in the presentation a few slides, when we ran that script, when we were here only at the point where we took content description and put it into a bucket called the current description, if we just push play without showing the gear icon, nothing would happen, because what we've done is take a value and put it in a bucket. Nothing happens to the user. We haven't set a color tag. We haven't changed the value. We've just taken the value and put it in the bucket. To examine that bucket, or to examine the variable, the current description, the gears icon represents a thing called properly results and variables. Is that correct, James?
Technical issues today. I hope it's okay. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you. So the correct name there is result and variables tab. So result and variables tab is the name of that gear icon, and it shows you the status of variables as you go. Next question, Arnab. Will these scripts work with earlier versions of Capture 110? I'm on my personal machine and running Capture 110. So first and foremost, script language is contingent on support inside of Capture One. So for example, I can't just open up any old application on my computer, like Chrome, and start typing in arbitrary AppleScript. Chrome has to put in support for any given noun and any given verb. In the case that we have just looked at, content description, color tag, current document, variants were all the nouns that we used, and all of that is supported for all the way back through at least Capture 110, maybe even Capture 1.9. Some specific syntax and some specific options may not have been introduced until 12 or even 20 or in the future. And actually, I say that, James, as the point person here, is content description a field that was introduced in 10 or in 11?
Testing me now. I think it might have been 10.
So the easiest way to answer that question definitively, the easiest way to answer that question definitively is actually to go to Script Debugger or Script Editor, open the dictionary for Capture 110, and type in content space description. And if you find an entry in the dictionary for that, you will know that it is supported. So just know that many but not all commands are supported by previous versions. If you have scripts, they should be appropriately used for that version or later, but they may run successfully on previous versions. Every single command, noun, and verb are also supported in the previous version. Next question or not. Does this script apply equally to Capture One catalogs as well as sessions? I'm so glad you asked this question. So the phrase or the noun document is kind of weird because most people either exclusively use sessions or exclusively use catalogs. And so they would expect that what they should talk to is, for example, tell application Capture 120 to tell the session or the current session. And the reason we don't use that noun is specifically because it could be either a catalog or a session. So the phrase document, the noun document, in this case, current document, applies equally to either a catalog or a session, whichever one you have open and frontmost in Capture One at that time. Great question. We'll take one more question on this example, and then we should move on to example 2. By the way, these are exactly the kind of questions we were hoping for. It really indicates that you guys are following along and getting something out of this. Okay, with no other questions, oh, sorry, one more question. So does this script run live while Capture One is open? Will the user see flags magically appear beside thumbnails while the script is running? That's a great question. Scripts occur in real time. And for more involved scripts or scripts that are running on larger numbers of images, it will take a meaningful and observable amount of time, and you will see any verb take its effect in near real time. When I say near real time, I mean a fraction of a second after the interface in Capture One will update. So when we run this on 3 variants, you won't be able to see it running. That is to say, you'll push play and then 3 variants will be read or not read according to their content description. If we run this on 30,000 variants, if you make the thumbnail size small enough, you can actually see it go through those 30,000. And the speed of that will depend on the speed of your computer and the speed of the hard drive and what operations you're doing, which verbs you're doing to which nouns. So yes, and later we'll look at, for example, the DT timelapse editor. The DT timelapse editor routinely works with hundreds of thousands of images, and you will absolutely see the progress take, in some cases, several minutes to complete an operation, and those will be reflected in near real time. All right, so I'm going to turn it over now to James, who will be talking about the second example, which is going to be conditional processing.
Okay, thanks, Doug. Let's hope this works. Okay, so in the next chapter, we're going to look at specifically what we call a command. And the idea here is we've successfully managed to isolate and figure out how to talk to the object model and the variants we're interested in by putting the if statement in. And now we want to do something with them. And so we can do that by issuing a command to Capture One. So the boss wants us to handle the images in a specific ways, depending on the status of the images. In this case, it makes of the images without captions and make TIFFs of the images with captions. So this is classic use case for scripting, kind of dealing with conditions and acting on them. This roughly translates as the following problem. So if the variant's content description is, and we've talked about this, double quotes means empty. So if the string is empty for the description field, process using JPEG recipe. And if the variant's content description is not, i.e. the opposite of empty, so if there is something, process using TIFF recipe. So first thing we need to kind of do, and also there's a reason for this, the first thing we'll do is look at how Capture One makes or converts a variant to a JPEG. In most cases, users will create and use a recipe, which is a set of instructions on how to deal with the raw file or convert it and enable it, and run it on the selection, and that will convert the raw to the JPEG. Without scripting, the user would be left to sift through the variants and need to be processed as JPEG and process them with the right recipe, and then repeat for the other recipe for the remaining variants, and that's kind of a lot of work. So note here, note that the script we are working on, we need the recipes pre-made because we're not today handling creation or testing to see if the recipe exists. So we're going to make them ahead of time. So if we can Capture One, we make these recipes pre-made, named correctly according to our problem, and enabled. And then we will just use the script to call those from the UI. So as described and demonstrated by Doug in the previous section, if we look up in the dictionary the command for process, you can see it here. So we can go through dictionary and search, or we can go through the object model, whichever is preferable. The syntax required by the command is actually illustrated here and actually quite close to the logic you would use in Capture One. The command is supplemented by a few parameters. Some are direct and required, and others are optional. Maybe a little complicated, but let's have a look. So the process command requires a list of variants to process, which is, and optionally the name of the recipe of the process to process with. So the simplest way to handle this is just take a look at what it looks like. So let's look at the syntax for how we would do this. Okay, so this is the simplest possible compiled script of how this syntax would work on a variant. As per the starter script, the script will run on process only the variant 1, or the first variant, of the current document, and it uses the recipe named JPEG. And it has to be case sensitive. I should make that. We are talking about pedantics of programming. This is a 1. So case sensitive, we're looking for the recipe called JPEG, and we're going to process variant 1 with recipe JPEG. Now you can see in the results window on the right-hand side, batch job identifier, which is the result of a process. A bit beyond today's scope. If you do this, it means it's worked. If it doesn't work, you will see a different string that says or starts with error. And if you can check the dictionary, and then you can see that. Okay, so what we're actually talking about here, if we try and do the truest coding parlance, this kind of problem is what we would class as an if-else statement. And this is one of the simple logic examples for a scripter. If the argument, or if the first argument in the if statement is true, do this. And if it is not, or at least if the first if equates to false, do that instead, or do this instead, do the next thing instead. So let's start by breaking the problem down again. As Doug says, let's do it one step at a time. Let's start breaking this down, revisit our old script from example 1. We've already built the if statement, and now we can expand it with the next instruction. So if you remember again, Doug's explanation of the repeat loop, each variant in variance is going to be looped through the code and in the repeat block and checked by the if statement that the content description is in fact empty. And if it is, do what? And it's going to check the content description is empty. We'll mark it red. And our new line here is process the variant, which is the instance of the single variant where it is true, and also process it. Great. So now everything that has 0 or a blank description will process. Next, we need to handle the events if the statement is not true. And we do that by inserting else. And you can see here in the example. So the else, note that the else follows the conditions for the first if statement, but it is still within the if block. So if the first if equates to false, then the code following else will run. And now this next line here is to process the variant with recipe TIFF. So we give the code an option if the first thing is false. If first thing is false, then we're going to use this. Okay.
Lost track of the slides here, so let's
no problem.
Make sure we're on the same page here.
89, I think.
There we go. Yep.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. No worries. Okay. So the boss has changed his mind again, as most of our bosses do, and wants us to do a bit more, but this time it's depending on what the caption is. And this is a kicker because the problem is now more than true or false. So it has more than 2 outcomes. We need to check for more volatile conditions. It could be a mix of results. Could be some things which are true, some things which are not. And so the request is to process JPEGs if the caption is empty, if the content description contains the copyright symbol, which is we're just going to imagine that we use copyright symbol in rights managed images for the sake of argument. Then we want those processed as TIFF. If the content description is marked for retouch or retoucher, process it as a. And then there's what about the rest? What are we going to do with those? So a good use case for this kind of, which is a kind of extension of else. It can be used whenever you need to define or check multiple conditions before continuing, and very useful in cases where you have more than 2 outcomes in this case. So here we've extended the solution a little bit. Again, same as before, if the description is empty, mark it as red and process it as JPEG. So that remains the same. The change here is going to be the next part, which is the else if. This time we're going to use else if to set a number of different conditions, which if true will run for that case. So back to the boss's request, our hypothetical caption format uses the copyright logo, which I believe is Command Alt G, if you wanted to type it out. Yeah, Alt G on Mac. Well, we're on Mac because it's AppleScript, so no worries. Right. Where was it? Oh yeah, so if it contains the copyright logo anywhere, because we don't know or we don't trust anybody to do it exactly the same for every case. If it's contained in the description field, and then we're going to mark that green and process it TIFF. And actually, we've just come across a new term here, contains. It's a new term, kind of what we call an operator. We haven't used this before, so let's quickly just take a look at operators. So it actually turns out we were using an operator all along. We were using is. Is equivalent to equal to, and this equates to true if both things, what you're comparing it to, is the same value. So looking at our example above, if the current description is empty, so if those things are true, then the code will execute. Now the contains, very literal and kind of similar to English, is used to see if the first thing is anywhere in the second thing. In our case, if the current description contains a copyright symbol, then, and again, if the character is anywhere in the string, then of course the statement equates to true and the code will execute. So there are many other operators to be aware of, and, or, starts with, ends with, is greater than, less than, is greater than or equal to, and many, many, many more. We've included the link here to the actual official Apple developer documentation, so you can have a look and see the full list. And these are useful for all sorts of problems where you need to check different conditions depending on what your script's trying to do. So continuing, same idea. Now we had, is it retouch or retoucher, but it doesn't matter because we're doing contains, so we can do a check for contains retouch. And then in this case, it depends, doesn't matter if it's retouch or retoucher. Both cases will get caught by this. So it contains retouch then, and now this time we and process it as recipe PSD. The last condition here, which is kind of optional because we didn't actually get a request from the boss specifying what to do with anything else. But this closes this if-else block. It's just another else, and it's like, otherwise, if there's anything left over, so we can do else, if nothing, if the case doesn't meet any of the first 3 or 4 cases, then do this. So I could leave this in or out, it wouldn't matter. But if I leave it out, anything that doesn't meet those conditions will be ignored by the processing, or ignored by the script for processing. So by putting an else in, I can do it kind of effectively like a catch. If there's anything that doesn't meet these rules, then process, and this one will mark it yellow and process with TIV2, just for the sake of argument.
Now, James, I want to point out that the way that this is constructed, that the way that you have done the if, else if, else if, else, and used different recipes, that anything that is true of those recipes will be applied to those variants. So for example, you could make them go into different subfolders as simply as making sure the correspondingly named process recipe puts its stuff into a subfolder, or is named differently, or is resolutioned up or down res, different color spaces, etc. You don't have to do that in the code because you are explicitly calling the name of a recipe that could have any number of different settings. Correct,
and in that way you avoid a lot of heavy lifting by having Capture One have a lot of the logic stored in the recipes, and we're just referencing those in a shorter script. Of course, you can define recipes if you want to, check that they exist. If they don't, make them, and then have all the code that handles. We have a demo of this later. We'll get to it, but it also does strike. It also does strike me, James, that in contrast to some of the other programming that we will be doing in the DT coding series, that since AppleScript is interacting with the application user interface, for a lack of a different term, that it's kind of nice logically to be able to know that what is happening in the code corresponds exactly to what's happening on the screen. So for example, after you ran this on all variants, if you took one more picture and then manually used one of the process recipes to process it, the exact same thing would happen, right? So it's a little bit more intuitive what's going on in real time in scripting than in normal command line or back end processing. Yeah, sure. I think it's fair to say a lot of the object model and the things you can do is based exactly on the Capture One interface. It does give you a very good one-to-one relationship of kind of concepts, ideas that can and cannot be done. Back to the question the gentleman asked before about whether or not this would work in 10, probably. But I do know this project to fully extend the capabilities of Capture One scripting has been ongoing since about version 3. So we have added functionality across the app for the last 5 versions, and the model has grown and grown and grown. Methodology
more verbs and more access to what you could do inside of Capture One.
Yeah, and there was a lot of like things which you couldn't do, but you could, and then beyond the scope of today. But the UI scripting, for example, that's all gone away now because we have the actual native objects you can interact with, and it's much more robust and a lot less prone to break. It's a lot less fragile because you actually have proper handles.
And to me, there's no need to be humble, James. I know that you've been a big proponent of that overall exercise, and I got to tell you, as an AppleScript user, I really appreciate it. So let's wrap up example 2. Can you tell us sort of what we accomplished and what we learned along the way?
Yeah, sure. So we've had a look at our very first command. There are many, but there's one of the most most prevalent or best use cases is process. So we looked at the command and its parameters. So how does the command interact and when you have to give it in order to work? We looked at the different operators that might be. So you can create different logic arguments and else and else if, and then, yeah, whether or not we want to create more complex conditions for our scripts.
Very good. Yeah, the else.
So hopefully that covers an awful lot, actually.
So we should stop for questions now. Arnav, if you could flag up any questions related to example 2. We will have one more example after this, and then we'll be doing a sort of next steps, followed by an open Q&A on any scripting topic as long as we have time.
Here, I think most of the questions that we have are more general or overarching. So
Fantastic.
Let's hold those until the end.
Fantastic. And we will have time to address at least several of those questions, so do please keep them coming. Arnav will flag them and we'll cover them at the end. So next, we're going to look at example 3, adding file name to metadata, and we're going to use that as an excuse to learn a few more new concepts before we move on. So our last example will be putting the current file name in the metadata. Again, let's ask why. Imagine you're on a really big untethered location shoot. So you've got multiple photographers, multiple models, multiple locations, multiple days, multiple assistants. Cards are flying everywhere. SD cards are being flung back and forth between the camera and the computer, and the assistants handing off to the second assistant who's downloading them from the digital tech. And at the end of that shoot, you're going to want to rename those files, right? Because especially with multiple camera brands and with multiple different file formats, you might have one that's DSC0001, and you might have another one that's CF0001, and those don't mean anything. So maybe we want to, at the very end of the project, rename all of the raw files from multiple photographers, multiple days, something like Nike footwear shoot 2020 June 7, 00001, 00002. Unifying them, prettifying them, making them have value. But if you think about it, when you rename raw files, what happens if somebody later on finds a card in their back pocket? And I would love to say this wasn't something that came from personal experience, but let's just pretend somebody had a card in their back pocket and a week later pulled it out and went, oh my gosh, is this a card from that shoot? If it is, are the images on it images that were downloaded or images that weren't downloaded? So if they've all been renamed, it's actually a little bit of a hassle. You could look at like date timestamps and compare the actual images, but think about it, you're looking at like 500 images, over here are 20,000 images. It's a pain in the butt to know definitively whether or not you got all those images, especially if any culling or deleting happened along the way. So a good practice might be to put the current file name in the metadata before you batch rename them, again, on these larger production shoots. If that's the request that we have, let's take a look at how we would put that in terms of coding parlance. So this actually looks a whole lot like one of our first examples. In fact, the overall structure is going to be almost identical, except that we need to know name as a token. So the only new noun here is name. Let's go looking for name. And if we look in the Object Explorer, we'll find that a variant contains an attribute called name, a noun called name, that we can get. We can't set it this way because we'd actually have to change the file name, but we can get the name of the variant. And boy, that makes it pretty easy to code. So let's go take a look at just getting that value. And again, if we ran with the gear icon on, we'd see the name of that populate. And that's kind of it. So let's use this as an excuse. Sorry, I just sort of lost my train of thought there. So let's use this as an excuse to expand out a new concept, because right now it will be putting the content description, it will be putting the name into the content description on all variants. But it's possible that we either have some of the files renamed already, or that we have other information in the content description that we don't want to overwrite right now. So we may only want to run this script on some of the variants. For example, a good way in the user interface would be to just select a range of them and have the script apply to the selected range of variants, not all variants. So how do we do that? Well, if again we go back to the object model, we look and we see that a variant actually has an attribute called selected. So just like the attribute color tag tells us what the color tag of a given variant is. The attribute selected tells us whether or not that variant is currently selected. And it is of type Boolean. So that's a new concept for us as well. A Boolean, B-O-O-L-E-A-N, is like, sorry, it's not like, it is either true or false. You can't be sort of selected, right? So if you can't be sort of selected, you're either selected true or selected false. And that is a Boolean type variable. So we could go back to our script and we could use an if statement. Just like we would say if color tag is 1, meaning if color tag is red, we could likewise say if selected status is true. Here we've taken selected and we put it into a variable called selected status, and we're then checking to see if that selected status is true. But there's a different way of accomplishing this. And if we look here on the left, we've just done the if statement. That looks very familiar, nothing new there. On the right, we've reframed this. Tell application capture 120, tell current documents, repeat with the variant in, variants whose selected is true. This is how we would make what is called a filtered reference. So instead of referencing all variants, we're only referencing filtered predicated on selection. We're only referencing variants whose selected is true. We can shorten this even further. So if we look back at that object model, we said that you had to go down that line. And that's actually kind of a lie, because there are some times where there are exceptions to that you can shortcut. So for example, if you reference variant, you can skip over document. If you skip over the document, it assumes that you want to use the current document. Okay, so let's take a look at that in code. Off to the left, we have tell current document, and on the right, we do not have tell current document. Without tell current document, the code runs exactly the same. And the reason is, if there's no document referenced, it assumes you want the current document, which is what we put in the other code anyway. So we've shortened the code, and if we take out those empty spaces, we see now we have a few fewer lines, 2 fewer lines, and we have a nice, short, easy to read script that takes variants whose selected is true, and for each of those variants, we repeat the question, or we repeat the statement that we should set the name into the content description. This is perfectly valid code, and again, this would be in your zip folder download. This would be the quote final of example 3. It sets the name in the content description for all selected variants. Now, we've done 2 things to shorten the code here, but I want to really emphasize for you that, especially when you're getting started, it can be tempting to just try to make your code as short as possible, and that's not always better. So, for example, here's a different similar script. Instead of setting the content description to the file name, we are instead setting the content description to string string, or quote quote, meaning an empty string. We're basically removing the content description in terms of normal user parlance. We're just taking it away. It's really readable. Even if you did not know anything about AppleScript coming in today, you could probably look at that script and say, I think it's setting the content description to be empty for all the variants that are selected. Great. This script could also be shortened to this. This is not terrible, but it's a really good indication that you can take something that is 10, 20, 30 lines of code and find ways to get it into 1 or 2 lines of code that look more complicated. And it's okay to admit that this is less understandable, and it's also much harder to annotate. We're going to look later, James is going to explain notes and putting notes into your code. You can't put notes into the middle of a line of code. So when you take all of this nice, verbose, easy to read and easy to understand structured code and compress it down to 1 or 2 lines of code, it can be harder to put in notes that explain what is going on in the code. So shorter, it's not always better. Let's go back to our boss's request, and let's see the last thing we wrote before we went on our errand to try to shorten inappropriately, and let's review what we've learned. So in example 3, our boss wanted us to put the current file name in the metadata. We looked up in the object model what name was, and name is just name, thankfully. And for each of the variants, we put name into content description. The new concepts here were really the whose clause. Again, that is called a filtered reference. There's a whole lot of filtered references, and it's a really powerful way to unpack the power of AppleScripting for Capture One. And we also learned about assumed references. That is, in the object model, occasionally you can skip one of those layers, and it will assume you mean a specific instance of the above layer. In this case, skipping tell document or tell current document, it assumes you mean the current document. So the code runs the same. Okay, so today so far we've done 3 examples. Let's say that you're getting pretty excited because honestly, it doesn't take that much to learn enough AppleScript to do some fairly basic things very powerfully that would otherwise take you hours and hours of manual labor. So let's say you're getting really excited. What's next? Jim. Oh, that's a stunning question or stunning point. Arnab, could you bring up any questions specific to example 3?
Most of the questions, again, are just kind of general overarching. We got a couple about JavaScript and recursive folder structures, so I think those are better saved to the end.
Excellent. Absolutely. Let's save those to the end, and let's talk about some next steps.
Okay. So these are the kind of tips, I guess. If you're starting out, it's not too long ago I started out, so I can still remember the frustrations I had trying to get this stuff to work. A few tips and ideas maybe and thoughts just to kind of, if you're starting out on this stuff, to kind of bear in mind. The first thing is constructing and writing. It's much like any writing. Structure and approach can vary a little bit. So the first tip I have is camel case. And I will confess, I had no idea what this was when I was starting, but camel case is kind of formatting, largely applies to variables, and it just makes them easier to read. Variables is kind of like compound noun structure, like my best selection or something like that. And the idea is just, it can be difficult to read when these variables are kind of are quite long. So the idea is to uppercase each first letter of every word after the first. And you can see it here in the title of the slide, camel case, with the uppercase C. And when you've got these in a big script or a long script and reading them, it makes it so much easier to read. And we'll have an example in the next slide we'll talk about. The other tip here is variables make sense. It's okay, we can go on to the next, actually, it kind of makes sense to talk about this in context. So variables that make sense. So if we have a look at the box on the left-hand side, a nondescript variable. Okay, and you can kind of see like, okay, that doesn't read very well. Also of no use because it doesn't mean anything. So you can see that on the right-hand side, we've got the variant B, and it just scans. And also the description of it is much more sensible as to what it does or what it's supposed to contain, to talk to your future self. Because Monday, I guarantee, if you've been doing this Friday night, Monday you come back to it, I guarantee you won't remember what the hell these things are supposed to be doing. And again, avoid things like, I do this, it's a bad habit, but it's shorthand. If you're scratching out a quick script just to test, I write nonsense variables just to get it working, and then I forget 10 minutes later what it's supposed to do. So get into the habit of writing, thinking a little bit about your variables and what they should be called, and you will just save yourself time and frustration. And this is what it's all about. So I'm just a bit behind. The next point and the next kind of good tip is comments. Why? Well, if you're working, I think if you're working on especially collaboration, and most professional software houses are team. If you write the function and someone else is supposed to pick it up and run with it, it's a good idea to put a comment in or ideas around your thought processes, leave the breadcrumbs as to what the thing is supposed to do. This is kind of goes to you as well, like, because like me, I'm working on 12 different projects at once, and I will come back to one 6 months later and forget what it does. Or even the function I wrote, I was having a brilliant time and it was working, and I'll come back to it and I'm like, I don't understand this at all. So comments, and the way you can do this is you type -- and then the text, And the dash dash excludes that line from the code when it is run, and it just kind of leaves it as a kind of a footsteps in the script as to what was done. You can do this on new line, or you can do it in line, so on the same line as functioning code after the code. So going back to what Doug said about, yes, you can simplify the script into one line. Beautiful code. But you can't put annotations in the middle of that. And also if there is an issue in that line, it will fail, and you can't do the next part, which is the line by line debugging, which is another good tip.
You also note here that the color in Script Debugger is gray for comments, including inline comments. So it is easier to see what is code that is being executed versus a note on that code or a comment on that code.
You can also leave spaces. You can put like carriage returns between the code to space it out a bit. Very dense, complex code can be quite overwhelming to scan and read. So you can space it out. No right or wrong way to do that, I don't. Another good idea, just for sanity's sake. Okay. Yes. Next, debug mode. Again, we have no affiliation to Script Debugger whatsoever, but the time this has saved me is worth the price of admission alone, and that's what it's all about at the end of the day. So when you're starting out, you are going to make mistakes, and a lot of them, even to a point you are probably going to throw things around the room. But the day that your script works, I promise you, the feeling is amazing. It's like, what's that Tom Hanks film, Castaway, when he's like made fire? It's like that. It's that good. So AppleScript's editor isn't very forgiving for exploring why a script fails. And in most cases, you have to do a lot of manual logging attempts, which results in way more complicated code, script scaffolding to do catches, and that's a semi-advanced skill in itself, and kind of we're starting out. So the script debugger gives you way more tools, and kind of like the name of the product gives it away. It's for help, like Doug says, you spend 80% time debugging. It's more verbose logging. It gives you breakpoints so you can stop your script in a certain place. You do line by line run and see the results in the results and properties windows. And it gives you a chance to, because the scripts execute pretty quickly, so it gives you a chance to kind of understand what's happening and where things are breaking, and just the time, again, the time and the sanity is worth whatever. They should charge twice as much, in my opinion. Okay, and that puts a big dent in otherwise what is quite a steep learning curve, I think, to get to your first working script, but yeah, that should help massively.
And that's a perfect segue, because one of the easiest way to get into your first working script is to start with somebody else's working script and make some minor changes. And that is not something to be ashamed of. That is in fact how almost all code in almost all languages, in almost all use cases is written, is starting with some other reasonably similar code and then making changes. That's true even of people who have 2 PhDs and have been working for 20 years. It's very rare for somebody to start with a totally blank, empty document and just start typing in. So in that regard, some next steps resources you might find. If you are looking for Capture One specific code, hey, I want to do something about adjusting the exposure or changing the crop, starting with Capture One specific code is very helpful. DT, that is us, we make a product called the DT coding, start with this. The scripts from this class, again, the zip file that you downloaded, feel free to use in any capacity whatsoever. They're all pretty basic, but you can start with those and make changes to those. The DT Building Blocks AppleScript Kit is a product on our website available for sale. You will get a link to it and a special offer on it in the follow-up email to this event. That is a set of 36 different scripts that do varying levels of very simple to fairly complicated things. The description of all 36 is on the website before you buy it, so you can see exactly what kind of functionality is there. And we really, really emphasize that while it's very possible you might find that one of those scripts exactly addresses a specific need you have, the main point of it is to provide a range of different correctly syntaxed and operative code from which you can then build your own. So it's building blocks for your own more robust, more specific, more customized code. But it's a heck of a lot easier to start with that than to start with a blank canvas. Another place to find Capture One specific code is the Capture One user forum. That is something that you'll find James' name on quite frequently in the scripting section. And more generally, if you have things that are not specific to Capture One, so if your question is just, how do I do a repeat loop in the Finder to pull up recursive folder structure? You may find that in one of the Capture One specific examples, but you will definitely find it on maxscriptor.net, forum.latenightsw.com, or via a Google, GitHub, or Stack Overflow search. I cannot tell you how impossible I imagine programming to have been in the era before Google, because I have seen people with 2 PhDs and a specialty in the language that I'm asking a question of go, yeah, I don't know, Google, right? Totally okay. So those are places to find other more general code. Just keep in mind that just because somebody put it on the internet does not mean A, it works, B, that it still works. It may have worked in Capture One 8 and not in Capture One 20, or C, that even if it works, it was the right sort of quote unquote right way of doing it nowadays. You'll find a lot of scripts on the internet, for example, that reference a token called selected variance. That is no longer a kosher way of finding variance whose selected is true. That is old language. It's like referring to ye old pint of beer. It will not do what you hope and want it to do. It should not be how you reference selected variants. So again, use other people's code. Shameless promotion for the fact that our DT AppleScript kit is designed for Capture 120 and is kept up to date, and I think is a very good, rigorous example of correctly coded scripts. But I'm sure there are others out there as well. Just don't assume that anything that you read is correct and current. And then lastly, of course, we have classes and consultation. DT does do consultation one-on-one with people. We are going to put up, right, James, oh, actually, that's the next slide. We're going to put up a survey on. And then finally, of course, the DT coding series capstone. Again, we'll be holding that in October of this year, and the date, as well as a special offer for that, will be emailed to you after this. I do want to show you one sneak peek on my side and one sneak peek on James' side of some of the kinds of things you could do with AppleScript for which you might attend the capstone class in order to get that level of skill. The DT time-lapse editor is a standalone sidecar application. So you launch Capture One, you launch the DT time-lapse editor, and in so doing, you have the ability to change the opened Capture One session in ways relevant to time-lapse editing. Great example is that in time-lapse, you often see a flicker of the brightness, and this will go through and even out that flicker. This also allows you to do ramps of exposure up or ramps of exposure down, contrast, local adjustments, gradients. It even lets you push in with a crop and then pull out to do dynamic resizing of the input raw files. You can imagine our clients who shoot with an IQ4 150, that's a 14,000 pixel wide file. You try to do some of these adjustments in, say, Premiere, and it just goes, I can't deal with 14,000 pixel images. Capture One time-lapse editor, or a DT time-lapse editor can. Another example of a capstone level stuff, James?
Yep, let's just check this is on. Yep, okay. Yeah, Capture One Enterprise and Cultural Heritage are versions of Capture One. I don't know how many of the audience are familiar with these, but these are specialized versions of Capture One Pro with an additional chunk of stuff, features on top, and those special features have additional scripting hooks to the Pro dictionary. So you will find some of these hooks don't work if you have Pro. You need Enterprise or Cultural Heritage in order to make them work. But they are designed, and again, it's largely mostly to do with the customer base I deal with, but they are designed to work for automation use cases where volume photography and the resulting processes are important considerations, not only to the business process, but also bottom line. If you've got a lot of work you need to do, obviously that's very expensive. So automation is a big consideration. So it comes with additional tools and scripting extensions for those tools to make workflows that would be otherwise impossible or inefficient. For example, in the enterprise version, and actually in Cultural Heritage, we have a lot of overlap between the two. There's some small changes, small differences, but mostly the same. For example, the barcode scanner comes with an event. So as I scan, the event is triggered and it will launch a script workflow. And that script workflow can be whatever you want to create. Make folders, read in data from another source. Excel is a good example, but you could do anything else. And you can combine this with additional tools. So scripting, you think of it as like a gluing language, and I can glue logic together, and that can be entirely encapsulated inside Capture One, or it could be another application or another OS source of information, and you combine the two together. So scan, go to the data, bring it back to Capture One, set up all the metadata. That is a perfectly fine use case for scripting. Perhaps though, also we want to do more things, perhaps automate style guides. So the guides, grids, and overlays, they are all completely scriptable or respond to scripting. I can bring in reference files perhaps and try and automate the style guides for a particular shot. That could be another interesting use case. So because you guys are all here and interested in this stuff, for webinar attendees today, we are sending out special offers on the enterprise version. If you want to take it up, great. If not, okay. Maybe start with Pro and maybe you want to come back later. That's cool. So yeah, so we will send out special offers via email to every attendee who's been here today. And we are also supporting DT for anybody who signs up with the capstone classes. We're going to provide an even more amazing offer, so you guys can get on board with that. So check your email after the webinar closes for the offers after the jump, and including the, is it the script debugger offer as well? So that's in that email as well, right?
Correct.
Yeah, so all the tools you need to get going. And then if there should be a poll, leave Arnold as it running. If there's anyone here interested in enterprise or CH version for their business, or just wants to have a chat about it, I'm around, I'm available to do one-to-one on solutions. So please just vote on the poll and we can set up a call when it's convenient and we'll go through possibilities and maybe even do a demo. So to that end, we have a short demo, which is a kind of built around enterprise type use cases around scripting, which is templating and automating kind of common processes. So I need to remember how this works now. Let's just do sharing, share screen. Just give me a nod, Doug, if you can see me.
Yep, I see your screen.
Okay, and you can see the logo now?
Yep.
Okay, so I'm going to run this through in real time and then we'll do it slowly so you can see what's going on. Okay, ready, go.
Jim, as you're running this, I'm just thinking about the number of manual steps I would have to go through to do this step by step.
Yeah, there's two scripts here. The first one executes in about 18 seconds in real time to set up the session. And the second one is an operator favorite, which is creating multiple shot folders for the shoot and ahead of time. So that's all done. So that's the two scripts running together. So now we'll just do that slow speed, quarter speed. Try it again. Whoops. Okay, so quarter speed. So let's talk this through now, what's happening. So first thing is I encapsulate some of my scripts as apps. It makes them a little sexier and a little easier to use. So you can run them from like an app like this from the dock, but you can also run them from the scripts menu inside Capture One. So we're quitting out, creating a new document using today's date and name of the user, set up the workspace. And now we're going to rebuild all the tools according to their supposed position and settings. So make sure that everything is reset. And we'll do it tab by tab. And then we're going to rebuild the toolbar to make sure no one has moved anything out that the operator needed. Create all the smart albums, a test collection capture folder, and import some test files from the server. Next thing to do is to make sure that the recipes are valid. And we are going to lock all the tools so they can't be edited, build the new recipes according to how they should be, and delete anything we don't need. And then we're going to rebuild all the guides and grids as per the style guides. And that's the first script finished. I don't think we need to go into the second one. It's pretty self-explanatory, which is just a repeat loop on building folders. But yeah, so that is the demo of that.
And so that actually brings us now to the open Q&A. So we are now able to address questions not specific to any of our examples, but on basically any topic of Capture One scripting. Keep in mind, of course, that this is meant to be fairly introductory, so we don't mind trying to take on something of intermediate difficulty, but we are not going to be able to answer the most advanced questions you might be able to throw at us in this context. But the capstone is a great place to tackle really advanced stuff. So let's dive in and see what questions we got, and let's see what we can answer here in the next 10 or 15 minutes. Arnab, how different does the hierarchy that you were looking at in Debugger look in Script Editor? So the Capture One dictionary can be found in Script Editor. Maybe, James, you could share your screen and then just open up Script Editor and open up the generic dictionary because it is absolutely usable and useful, but you can see that it's just not going to be as useful as the one in Script Debugger. Okay, so that's Script Debugger, and then we're going to open up, in contrast, Script Editor.
Whoops.
And in Script Editor, we go to File, Open Dictionary. We'll select Capture One from the applications list. And when we open that up, you'll see a list of commands and syntax. You will not see that same hierarchical structure. So if you wanted to find, for example, color tag, could you search for color tag, please? We search for color tag, and what we'll find is color tag is listed. And when you look at the entry for color tag, it will explicitly state it is a noun, variant N, and it belongs to variant. So at the top of this list, you'll see variant, and then it's a listed attribute. Sorry, the correct term is property, not attribute. A listed property of variant. So you can get a sense that the color tag belongs to variant. You would then need to look up variant to see what it belongs to, and then look to see what that belongs to get a sense of the object model. So similar information, maybe not nearly as well detailed or illustrated. Next question.
Is Arnab here. I'm just going to kind of combine a bunch of questions that we had on sort of recursive folder structures. So the questions are basically all around, if I have a program that I'm working on, right, it's addressing a current folder, and then I have enclosing folders with process variants or additional images, does current document refer to those as well? How do I work sort of on all of those enclosed folders? What do I have to change? What stays the same? That sort of stuff.
So let's break this question into two generalized topics: file navigation through the Finder and variant navigation through Capture One. So James, in your open dialog there, could you start a new document and type in the following syntax? This is going to be a great example of how hard it is to type commands exactly correct in real time, verbally only. But we're going to put Jim to the test here. Tell application Finder, Finder of course in quotes, to get entire contents of, and then in parentheses, choose folder, end parentheses, and then after the end parentheses, as alias list. Okay, so we're just going to run that, and please look at the log underneath. Actually, instead of yeah, perfect, great. So, and just now pointed at any folder that contains subfolders that contain images that you don't mind us seeing.
Okay, this is the output folder of the session in the video you just
saw.
saw.
But that's only a level. Go back up 2 levels to demo session so we have multiple levels of stuff. Okay, and push choose.
That's the right one.
Yeah, it looks right to me.
That one. That's demo session. Okay, choose.
Great, and then what you'll see off to the right is that it has populated the result because we have not stored we've used get entire contents. We haven't stored that in a variable. So the only place we see that is going to be the results gear tab. But we see there a long list of different stuff. And that is because get entire contents allows you to pull up every single thing recursively through as many lines of the code as many layers of the hierarchy as you want. Real quick admonition, especially if you're furiously typing this at home, be very, very careful at targeting this command somewhere very low on your computer. For example, if you do get entire contents, and when you choose folder, you select your main hard drive, it may take 2 hours to come back with a list of 400,000 items, especially if you point it across at a server or something. But the point is, if we had a session containing subfolders, containing subfolders, containing subfolders, each of which had some unusual number or unpredictable number of images, this would bring them up. We would then need to do, depending on our use case, some form of filtered reference. So for example, we could use whose name starts with X, or ends with X, or contains .cr2, or contains does not contain .cos. There's a lot of different whose clauses you could use to generate a list of files inside of there that we care about. I want to bring this up not because we're going to be able to cover the entirety of Finder navigation, but to bring up sort of two big high-level concepts. One is that in AppleScript, you can refer to files through a few different sublanguages. Sublanguage may not be the right term here. You notice the phrase as alias list. You can refer to a file on the hard drive in AppleScript as a alias, as a POSIX file, meaning that it uses slashes, or in the normal Mac OS methodology, which uses colons. Those three different things, POSIX, alias, and the third thing. Do you remember the name of the third thing?
It's Finder object reference.
Finder object reference. So three different ways of naming or pointing to a file all do different things. You can't mix and match them very easily unless you know about all three, and they are confusing as heck. So if you get involved in any code where you're using the Finder as opposed to Capture One, I'd really encourage you to research POSIX file versus Mac object reference versus alias, and learn a lot about those before you try to write any code referencing a file. That's if you're referencing them via the Finder. Jim, could you walk us through how we could use, at least at the top level, collections to reference more than just the raw files of the current session's currently viewed folder?
One more time?
Sure. So the code we wrote today, for example, if you could go to example 2. Example 2 references variants of the current document. So please highlight the lines for tell and repeat. And we'll see that we're telling the current document, the current session, to work with the variants in the current document.
Okay.
And that specifically means, correct me if I'm wrong, that specifically means the variants of the currently viewed folder or collection of the current document. True?
It means all the variants of the document. So if you have stuff stored in smart albums or albums, if you have an all images album, I believe it's all variants which are referenced. It could be in the
that essentially are currently being referenced. So you're right that if you go to all images and run this script, it would run on all subfolders, all favorites, everything. Yeah. But if you were, for example, only viewing the third favorite, in the third favorite, you would have variants that populate the variants of the third,
sure.
Third favorite.
So if you just want to say act on the ones I'm looking at in whatever collection I'm in, is that right?
Well, so specifically, that's what you're doing. I guess what we're explaining is that if you want to work recursively on subfolders, one easy way to do that without a lot of complicated code is to use current document and variants, and then make Capture One view all images. Because if you have Capture One the session, can you go to Capture One, drag it in there, and just go to all images? If you go to all images, and you had 10 subfolders, each of which had 100 files, then you'd be able to run on all 1,000 of the resulting files with one script that looks exactly like this.
Yeah, now, I think there's, well, I mean, I'd have to test this because it's not something I've actually tried, but I believe because the images are referenced in a collection type, which is either a smart album or an album, they are effectively variants of the document. In a session, unless the folders are linked either by a favorite or a reference to a collection, they are not of the document.
Correct. So I agree with that entirely. So what you just said is, if it's a favorite in Capture One, and if you're viewing all images, which includes those favorites, then the document's variants include all of those subfolders.
Yes.
Yep. So that is the easiest possible way of dealing with more than one folder's worth of stuff, because you don't have to get into recursive references and understand file structures and parse and navigate the Finder. So if your problem can be solved like that, that is a good way to go. If not, you're going to have to start to learn how to take from Capture One the collections nouns from Finder, different subfolders that may or may not be part of the images loaded into Capture One using favorites, and load the one into the other. And that is definitely a topic out of scope for today.
Yeah, it's pretty complicated, but you could do something like that.
Oh, brilliant. So that skips, regardless of what the user has selected in Capture One, it specifically points to the collection whose name is all images.
Sure.
James,
Or,
that's why we pay the big bucks.
or if you wanted to do just the specific collection you're working on, so let's say navigate through my favorites one by one, and then execute the script either by a shortcut, or there's many ways to do that, but we could just say total current collection. And we have current collection as a shortcut as well. So that the current collection of the current document of application Capture One, and then the code between will execute on whatever I'm looking at rather than.
And collections is also an acceptable noun form, right? Collections plural. Is that right?
Repeat.
Yes, collection. So we could also repeat the collection in collections, and it would systematically go through each collection. Yeah. You would probably want to add a whose clause there to avoid collections that were, for example, rejects or culled images.
There was a question at the start about how true is this for catalogs and sessions. There are some changes in obviously the capability of catalogs and the capability of sessions. They have different collection capabilities, and so some of the scripting stuff is very relative to sessions. Favorites, for example, doesn't exist in catalogs. Groups and projects does not exist in sessions. So like recursive collection searching for catalogs is very different approach to working with the underlying file folder type strategy that you get in sessions.
Okay.
I would class that as advanced, actually. It's pretty advanced in terms of concepts.
I think we should move on to the next question. We've covered at least some of the key terminology you can Google on your own in order to dive deeper into those topics. And certainly the capstone class will include more on folder and file navigation, especially when you're talking about very large quantities of files spread across many different levels of recursive folder structure. Arnab, next question, please. And I think we have time for, I would say, 2 or 3 more questions. That sound right, James?
All right, great. Once again, I'm just going to combine a couple of questions here, and I know that we talked about this on the run through. Tell me about JavaScript and sort of what the capabilities are there. And I know this is more in depth, but just kind of briefly.
Yep. So Jim, there is a type of AppleScripting that is native AppleScripting, which is what we have been typing in now. It's like speaking in American English. And there is a different iteration of this that is coded via JavaScript language.
Yes. So,
can you tell us a little bit about the pros and cons of if somebody is looking at this for the first time and they don't know, should I learn AppleScript via native AppleScript, or should I learn the JavaScript encapsulated or translated form of AppleScript? Which one?
Okay. So I mean, I can speak to this personally because I'm trying to learn JavaScript in parallel for other reasons and other applications. So I mean, I've started with AppleScript because the syntax is more. I think if you're native English, maybe it makes to get going. I would compare AppleScript as Duplo to the Lego of JavaScript. So JavaScript's probably got it's vast, and there's lots of stuff you can do with JavaScript. There's a huge amount of libraries for UI and all sorts of things you can do with JavaScript. But it is pretty even more daunting than this. If this is daunting, I mean, this is fairly as simple as it gets in terms of getting going with a language, I think. JavaScript, Mac, or at least Apple, sorry, added the capability to do what we call JavaScript for automation to the operating system. So underneath all the service level stuff is an infrastructure called AppleScript events, and it basically just allows you to use the same objects that we have and talk to Apple events, but using a JavaScript kind of syntax. So you can if you know JavaScript, that's probably a better place to start than trying to learn AppleScript from scratch. But
on your way to or already know JavaScript, then forget all the syntax we learned today and go look up JavaScript for automation. And that is often referenced by the shorting name JXA, and learn it that way. If you don't already know JavaScript, my suggestion personally, especially if you're a new programmer, is that AppleScript is a little bit more English readable. James's point is correct that AppleScript natively is also a little less useful broadly. It's not usable in other forms. But personally, I prefer that as a beginner's language. So those are some pros and cons, and you kind of have to make your own choice. During the capstone class, we'll be focused primarily on Python, native AppleScript, and then a language to use the Capture One SDK, which is still TBD, but probably somewhat one of the C's, C# or Objective-C. Great. Next question.
Let's do two things here. I'm going to give you a couple of rapid fire yes or no questions that we can go through quickly. And then I think we've got one more in-depth question that's really good that a couple people were asking. So first off, can you construct a session and workspace like that in Pro? Great.
Yes. There are differences between Pro and Enterprise and CH. That is not one of the differences.
Is there a way to amend metadata within the variants without outputting to a new file?
You can set the metadata that Capture One is applying to the image. As we all know, Capture One does not edit the raw file itself, so that information is held in a sidecar called a COS file. That metadata only survives long-term if it is then used to process a TIFF or a JPEG. So the answer is yes, sort of.
Excellent. Okay. Can you use keywords instead of content description?
Absolutely. And in fact, there are a few reasons why the examples we presented today are less than optimal. For example, James, could you open up example 1 and the final version of example 1? And I'll just point out that using a color tag is visually advantageous. You can look at a folder full of 200 raw files and see which ones were red tagged very, very quickly. And you can also filter by red tag very quickly in the UI. However, using the color tag also means that if you're using the color tag in this capacity, you'd be overwriting any information carried by the color tag before. So for example, if the art director came through and tagged things green, yellow, red for good, maybe no, then if I used this script as coded right now, I'd be overwriting the green tag of the art director. So it might be advantageous to use something else, such as a collection, a keyword, a metadata field for this, and likewise content description, it might be advantageous to use a different metadata field. Can you remind me, Arnab, what was the suggestion other than content description that he was asking about specifically? Keyword would be an acceptable place to put the name. It's a little bit out of the normal use of keyword because keywords are usually unique and you don't want a super long list of them. If you imagine 10,000 raw files, you'd end up with 10,000 keywords. But you could do it, and I could see some pros and cons there.
Excellent. One more of the rapid fire questions. Is there a way to automate scripts on import in case you forget to run a script before a batch rename?
So the broad topic that we'll address here, instead of answering the question super directly, is if you could open up the dictionary, James, and point out the script runners. So one of those script runners is on capture. And it runs the moment an image is captured.
So if you look at the object model, you've got these on
and
example.
Yep. So capture done script. So you can write a script, and then in Capture One, you can point Capture One to run that script anytime a capture has been completed. Now that is not the same as on import, but to my knowledge, James, there is not currently a import script. Is that correct?
An event for when
an event trigger for on import. I don't believe there is.
Not an event, no.
Okay. So if you had a use case for that, I have 2 words of advice for you. If you request that as a feature, and other people also request it as a feature, you have a decent chance that that might be implemented. Second is that if you are an enterprise user specifically, there is a sort of whole nother level of tier of support and interaction with the engineering team when you are an enterprise user. So if you were an enterprise user saying, we really desperately need an unimport script, I think the chances are even better that we could get that in there for you. As of right now, you would have to, I guess, Jim, monitor the folder using a finder action to trigger a script when a new file gets into the folder, and then you'd have to do some sort of validation against whether or not it was a previous file with some sort of UUID, file size, file date maybe. It would be kind of complicated. Whereas if there was a true and proper hook event, you would just write a few lines of code, and you would point capture one to run that code when a file has been imported.
Yeah, it would be difficult to do an event trigger script right now, but it's a good feature request, something we can take on as a separate thing.
Very good. I think we have time for one last question, Arnab, if you got it. Otherwise, we will wrap up for the day.
Yes, so one more question that a couple of people have asked. How do you manage script versioning with AppleScript?
Great question. So in the broader world of computer programming, there is, as you would imagine, if you are Amazon running the entire Amazon website, and that is at the back end programming, you might have, I honestly have no idea, 200, 2,000 different programmers collaborating in real time to make any change on that website. And you can imagine that there are very robust tools for collaboration, versioning, meaning keeping track of which iteration of the script you are running, and updating it over time. There is not a lot for that in AppleScript. For example, GitHub will allow you to store AppleScripts and recall AppleScripts, put them up and pull them down, but there's not the same level of toolkit you could use with, for example, Python or C++ or Objective-C or any of the more robust computer programming languages. So my answer is I have a folder called _deprecated. When I make a new version, I update one of the notes at the top of the script with a date and time and some notes about what I've changed, and I move the previous version into deprecated. There may or may not be better ways of doing that. That is how I'm doing it, and there is not a robust corporate enterprise level way of doing script versioning. Any comments there, Jim?
No, I think we've covered it. Unless there's more to the question.
No, I think it sounds like that gentleman has programming experience and is going, well, how the heck do I keep track of more sophisticated projects when I'm using AppleScript? And that is certainly a challenge. Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll be ending the webinar shortly. A reminder to you that an email will be sent to you following this event with special offers, discount codes, promotions, etc. I think you'll find one of them especially good if you are interested in taking the capstone class, but I will leave that as a surprise for you when you open up that email. So until then, be healthy, be sane, be well, and thanks for attending. Kate, you may end the webinar.